Voice today. Did we? Okay, we're going. I don't get to hear that lady's voice. So anyway, I was talking to Wayne again this week, and he said this has been a weird summer there in that little town he lives in, Lenore, there in Tennessee, and apparently this summer they had an influx of squirrels. Just Wayne. Yeah, Wayne. So yeah. So anyway, you're killing my timing. They never did this to Jackie Mason on the Ed Sullivan Show. So anyway, I was talking to Wayne, and this summer they had an influx of squirrels. And I guess they just filled the town. It got ridiculous. They were getting in the supermarkets and on the roads. Is it getting darker in here, or is it just me? Okay. And so anyway, boy, you're killing this joke, you guys. You are just killing this joke. So anyway, the squirrels got into the churches, and it got really bad because on Sunday morning the church would be filled with squirrels, and so all the churches had to. That's not the punchline yet. All the churches had to deal with it, and he said that the local Catholic church is kind of the richest, biggest church in town. They spent thousands apparently on rodent eradication strategies and hiring companies, and sure enough, the very next Sunday,
have we heard this before?
And the United Methodist Church, they declared themselves a squirrel sanctuary, and they actually put straw bedding in and food for the squirrels, and they allowed Mother Earth, goddess, to bless the squirrels. Wayne's church was actually the most successful there, his little Baptist church. They had the elders actually rounded up all the squirrels. The pastor baptized them, made them members of the church, and then they never saw them again. Whew. Thank you. Oh, that was a tough one today, folks. I got through it, though. Thank you very much. Man, I thought I lost it there for a minute, but I pulled it out. Yeah, okay. All right, well, amazingly enough, today we're going to talk about demon possession, and clearly all of you are. So, demon possession in the time of Jesus and the time of the Messiah was quite widespread in antiquity. And again, the belief was that a lot of things were caused that we now would know was caused by, biological means or environmental means. The idea was that a lot of it was caused by demonic activity of some sort or evil spirits. Now, saying that doesn't discount the fact that when Messiah himself was on earth, he was directly in the attack of demonic forces. That by saying that the ancient Greeks and Semitic tribes believed evil spirits could contaminate your water is not discounting the fact that Jesus had direct interaction with demonic forces. So please don't confuse those two. But non-biblically, you can read about demonic exorcisms in the Midrash, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Some of the parts of that have it. Josephus, the great historian, talks about it. Origen, the Christian historian, talks about demonic possession. So we know that it was the act of exorcism and dealing with demons was widespread throughout the first century. It is interesting. Now, I know I've talked about this before, that there's a difference between the Protestant Bible that we use and the Bible they use down the street at our friends at the Catholic Church. And that difference is in the Old Testament. They have a couple of more books than we do. And one of the books that the Catholic Church has in their Old Testament is called the Book of Tobit. And it's actually a really wonderful little read. If you ever get a chance to read Tobit, it's a great little story about a blind guy and there's a marriage and all this stuff. But in there's actually an example of exorcism of a demonic spirit actually using rotten fish. So if you have a problem with demons at your house, you may want to try some rotten fish because it worked for Tobit. We find that in the Old Testament, there's an example of David driving a melancholy demon out of Saul by playing music. So there you go. If you ever feel you're demon possessed, let Josh roll up with his guitar and he may sing it out of you. In the New Testament, we know that there were unnamed people who are driving demons out because the disciples come to Jesus and say, wait a minute, there's people driving demons out in your name, and that's our gig. How come they haven't, that's a copyright issue with us, and Jesus says it's okay. If you're on my side, you're on my side, so you can do that. So we know that even in the New Testament, we find stories of people other than Jesus driving out demons. So it was a very common thing. Now, there was a formula that the rabbis would use to drive a demon out, okay? And they would go up to the demon-possessed person, and they would say, hello, I'm Rabbi Shlomo. I understand you're a demon in this guy. What's your name? And the demon would growl out, I am Argam. And he'd say, it's so nice to meet you, Argam. Get out! And the guy would have to jump out, right? And that was how they had to know the name of the demon. And then by the power of God, they would call the demon by name, and it would have to jump out. I found that interesting because I don't know about you, but I picture the demons all kind of back at Demon Central at the Union Hall, hanging out by the water cooler, talking, and the one demon says, yeah, I know, I told him my name and I had to get out. The guy goes, man, I keep forgetting not to tell him my name, because that seemed to be the way the rabbis could drive a demon out. Now that posed a problem for rabbis if they ran into a person who was demon possessed who couldn't speak the name. If that person was deaf or if they were mute, then that interaction of calling on the demon to give his name so the rabbi could cast him out couldn't take place. So this began to be a messianic miracle because the Messiah would know the demon and wouldn't need to rely on the person speaking out the demon's name or hearing it. So that's how this casting a demon out of a mute and deaf person or a mute and blind person, that's how this became a messianic miracle, because the Messiah had powers the rabbis didn't. So the Messiah could cast out a demon in a situation where the rabbi's power was limited, okay? This is very important because the story of Jesus casting the demon out that we're going to read here in a little bit in Matthew is a pivotal point in the life of Messiah and Israel. If you remember back 4 weeks ago when we did the introduction, and then the second week when we talked about the Gospels and whatnot, I said that we can tie Messiah to the prophecy of Daniel's 70 weeks. And almost to the very day, we can see how Daniel predicted that Messiah would come, but we also know that Daniel predicted Messiah would be cut off. And we understand Messiah being cut off in Daniel as the death and rejection of the Messiah by Israel. And so I fully believe that Jesus came fully to fulfill the exact Old Testament prophecy of the coming of Messiah. And when he came through his birth, as we've seen, fulfills the prophecies, his baptism fulfills the promises of the Old Testament of the prophets. And Jesus came as Messiah to offer the Messianic kingdom to Israel. But at some point, and that's where we're at today, Israel rejected the Messiah. And because of that rejection, which we'll see today, Israel, that generation, was punished. And we find the punishment fell in 70 AD when Rome sacked and burned Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, and killed many, many Jews. And they had to flee and were dispersed. And they have not been reunited since then. So Jesus's healing of the demon, exorcism of the demon today, is that central point where it moves from Messiah presenting the kingdom to Messiah being rejected by Israel. Now, let me just say, that doesn't mean that Messiah failed. God clearly knew that there would be a rejection. And so what we find is a shift in Messiah's ministry. And we can trace this back to Jesus's birth. Remember the two birth stories in Matthew and Luke. Up to this point, Jesus was the Messiah offering the kingdom. When Israel rejected the Messiah and sought to kill him, Jesus shifted from the kingly Messiah, which we see the Matthew birth story, to the sacrificial Messiah, which we see in Luke. If you remember back in Luke, we talked about the whole thing with shepherds and Jesus being born in Bethlehem, and that was where the perfect lambs were raised to be slaughtered on Passover as a sacrifice. And Jesus was born right there, cheek to jowl, with those sinless lambs. So we see early on Jesus being portrayed both as the kingly Messiah as well as the sacrificial Messiah. And so it is this rejection by Israel of the Messianic kingdom of Jesus as Messiah that then moves him into the sacrificial position, which for us is a great deal. Because if you think about it, if the Jews had accepted the kingdom back then, we'd be out of luck, right? And so what we have is salvation for all of us, thanks to Israel rejecting Jesus. I mean, that's how it plays out for us. So we're at this midpoint now, and it all hinges on this demon possession. So if we go to Matthew, 12, and we start at, let's start around verse 22. Okay, so Matthew 12, verse 22, Jesus is going to heal this demon-possessed man. So I'm reading at verse 22. Then they brought to him a demon-possessed man who was blind and mute. So the demon couldn't tell Jesus' name, right? So a rabbi couldn't do this. So Jesus, though, knew. So Jesus healed him so that the man could now speak and see. Now, I've said this over and over again. The way we know what happens, the validation for what happens in a biblical story is not only the author telling us what happened, but the author recording how the crowd reacts. Notice the reaction here in verse 23. Jesus heals the man so he could now speak and see. All the crowds were amazed and said, "Could this one be the son of David?" That son of David was a technical term for Messiah. So Jesus works this miracle, and it's not just a nice thing, pat on the head to this guy who goes off now unpossessed, repossessed, however you say that. Jesus actually, the crowd sees this, they recognize it for what it is, a messianic miracle, and the crowd responds saying, "Could this man be the Messiah?" Right? I mean, think about that. This is a crowd. This isn't Pharisees and scribes. This isn't Jesus's disciples, although they were probably there. This is the crowd of people who see this and say, "This one, he could be the Messiah." So the reaction of the crowd tells us a great deal. But look at how now we see the Pharisees react to the same thing. Pharisees have seen this same thing. The crowd says, "This could be Messiah." And now we go down to the Pharisees' response in verse 24. "But when the Pharisees heard, they said, 'He doesn't cast out demons except by the power of Beelzebul, the ruler of demons.'" So, I mean, you have to think of this contrast. Jesus performs a miracle that the rabbis couldn't perform. The crowd knows that. They're in awe. Could this one be the Messiah? And the Pharisees, who just are against Jesus at this point, they go, "No, he's doing it through the power of the evil one." I mean, how could you have, there's no middle ground here. You have shock and awe that he's Messiah, or you have he's Satan. It is amazing to me the contrast between these two responses. Now Jesus responds. Verse 25. "Now when Jesus realized what they were thinking, he said to them, 'Every kingdom divided against itself is destroyed, and no town or house divided against itself will stand. So if Satan casts out demons, he's divided against himself. how will then his kingdom stand? So Jesus is not saying, no, you're wrong, and, yelling at him and cursing in Aramaic. Jesus is very logically saying, wait a minute, think through what you're saying here, Mr. Pharisee. If I'm doing it by Satan and I'm driving Satan's demons out, then Satan is at war with himself. And if he's at war with himself, how is he ever going to win? I mean, Jesus answers in a very logical way. Again, you would expect the Pharisees to go, "Oy vey, this guy's right. How could we be so wrong? You are Messiah." But they don't. Jesus continues, "If I cast out demons by Beelzebul, how do your sons cast them out?" In other words, look, if I'm casting out demons by the power of Satan, when you rabbis do it, who are you casting them out by? You claim you're doing it by God, but aren't you doing it by Satan too? So he flips it on them. Again, he's directly deflecting every point of disagreement they have with him. So then Jesus continues, "I cast them out for this reason, they will be your judges." So in other words, the rabbis who cast out demons will judge the rabbis who claim that Jesus. So he's saying this contradiction is destroying you. You will be judged by your own words. Okay, so he's directly interacting with them over this issue of attributing the work of God to the work of Satan. Jesus continued, "But if I cast out demons by the Spirit of God, then the kingdom of God has already overtaken you." He's saying, look, I don't cast them out by the power of Satan, and I just proved that to you logically. But what if I'm casting them out by the Spirit of God? If I am, then the kingdom is right here. So he's directly saying, I am Messiah, and the kingdom is available to you right now. And then he continues, verse 29, "How else can someone enter a strong man's house and steal his property unless he first ties up the strong man? Then he can thoroughly plunder the house. Who is not with me is against me, and whoever does not gather with me scatters. For this reason I tell you, people will be forgiven every sin and blasphemy, but the blasphemy against the Spirit will not be forgiven. Whoever speaks a word against the Son of Man will be forgiven, but whoever speaks against the Holy Spirit will not be forgiven, either in this age or in the age to come." So Jesus condemns the Pharisees, and he says, look, it can't be the case. And you could trash me, but if you speak against the work of God, then you're lost. And Jesus is pointing out to the Pharisees that you've got two choices. You either see the work of God and the kingdom in front of you, or you blaspheme God and you're lost by claiming that the divine work was actually the work of Satan. I want to talk about this passage because there is an effect this passage, if we kind of step out of our look at the Messiah for a minute. This passage has caused a lot of trouble to people. I have had people over the years many times come up and say, I'm really worried that I might have committed the unpardonable sin. And they point to this passage as the unpardonable sin. And it's like, well, number one, I don't want to hear what you did, I just don't. But the next question is, okay, what did you do? Right? And they say, I don't know. I kicked my dog when I came home after a bad day at work, and I'm convinced I have committed the unpardonable sin. And you say, okay. You didn't commit the unpardonable sin. And then you walk them through this passage, and you say, okay, what does the Bible say? What does this text say about the unpardonable sin? Number one, it tells us what that sin is. It's to attribute the work of God to Satan. Okay? If you have not attributed the work of God to Satan, no matter how awful the thing you did, whether you kicked your dog or not, you haven't committed the unpardonable sin. So just check that one off. You're great. I can't imagine any of us in this room, because we're the holy huddle, how anybody could attribute the work of God to Satan. But that's what you have to do to commit the unpardonable sin. If you say, well, no, I'm pretty sure I committed it. I know I didn't do that, but I just feel convicted in my heart that I must, and then they continue on and they want to, for some reason, they want you to tell them they did this. So the next thing you have to point out is that the unpardonable sin is not a single action. It's an internal focus, okay? All of us have at moments had doubts about our faith. It's normal. You go, oh, what if this really isn't true? What if I'm really not saved? What if Jesus was just a good everybody at some point in their life, in that dark night of the soul, has some little gnawing insecurity about your faith. I honestly think if you don't, you probably you're not wrestling with your faith to grow in it. And it's okay to have little doubts. But realize that what the sin here, attributing the work of God to Satan, was not a momentary doubt on the part of the Pharisees. The Pharisees have been turning away from God and Messiah the entire story, right? From Herod killing the innocents to make sure Jesus was dead as a baby, up through them conspiring to kill Jesus when he raised Lazarus from the dead. The Pharisees have an internal focus against God and his work because it's not how they view it. So the unpardonable sin has to be a sin against God, has to be attributing God's work to Satan. It has to be an internal set focus that you have, not a momentary lack of trust or belief. And then the last reason why you can't commit the unpardonable sin is it was committed once and once only by that generation of Israel. Now remember how God dealt with Israel. Throughout Israel's history, from Abraham forward, God has always dealt with Israel based on how the leadership of Israel has brought the nation forward. And if the leadership of Israel is bad, Israel gets punished. And if the leadership is good, Israel gets blessed. That's different in the church age, by the way. In the church age, it's a very individual thing. We are saved by our personal relationship with Jesus and our position with God, not by whether our pastor is saved or not. Do you see what I'm saying? For Israel, if the king of Israel was wicked and worshiped idols and did terrible things, Israel was punished. In our case, Mike is not this way, but let's say Mike went off the rails and suddenly did, I don't know, some terrible thing. He started to like Florida Georgia Line music or something just absolutely unforgivable. Yeah, country music fans here will vouch for me on that one. But let's say Mike did something terrible. That doesn't affect our salvation. So am I. I'm having trouble connecting up here. Yeah, that's it. Yeah. So what I'm saying is that Mike could do terrible things. He never will. Mike's a saint. But if he did, it doesn't affect us. Whereas in Israel, if the king was corrupt, Israel was corrupt. And so you have the leadership of Israel, the scribes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the priests at the temple. They were so corrupt and so bad at this point that Jesus is condemning Israel and that generation and those people. So even if you wanted to commit the unpardonable sin the way the gospel presents it, you just can't, because even as the oldest person in this room, I think it's Don, the oldest person in this room was not around in the first century. Don came about, 300 AD, I think? Yeah.
Well preserved.
Well preserved. It's that white lightning, which is salsa, by the way. It's salsa, not still whiskey. Okay, so now I want to talk, now that we've assumed that nobody here could commit the unpardonable sin, hope you're all good with that. You can all go home, rest easy today. You can commit other sins. Feel free. It's Sunday afternoon. You got nothing to do. But the unpardonable sin is out of your reach. Okay. I included a chart here, and it turned out very tiny. Sorry that it's so tiny. On the second page of your notes. And this is looking at Leviticus and Deuteronomy. And remember that all of this stuff we're reading took place under the Mosaic Law, and this is all under the Mosaic Law. This is the sort of chart of discipline of how God will discipline Israel. And God sort of has a 5 levels of discipline, from the easiest, first degree, all the way up to destroying them. And so you can look through this chart, and we see down the left-hand column is Leviticus, across the top is Deuteronomy. These coordinate within your text. The first degree of discipline is, physical disease, some enemies shooting arrows at you, national fear, this is the kind of stuff we see all the time in the book of Judges, the cycle of Judges. In Judges, honestly, if you're reading through the Bible in a year, if you read the first big story in Judges, you can leave the rest of it out because it just repeats. Basically, the book of Judges, Israel's doing okay. They fall into some sort of sin. God punishes them by having an enemy attack them, and Israel screams out, save me, and God saves them. Repeat, right? Wash, rinse, repeat. It's the same cycle through the book of Judges. And those are all kind of first level. But if you go all the way down to the 5th degree, you notice every box is checked. That is, it is bad. It is like the worst possible thing that could happen to Israel. And it has happened twice in the history of Israel where all 5 boxes have been checked. The first was the Babylonian captivity. And then God released them from that. And the second was the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD by Rome. And that destruction of 70 AD by Rome checked all 5 boxes. That was the result of Jesus' condemnation of Israel for attributing the work of the Messiah to Satan. So under the Mosaic Law, God said, here's how we're going to do this. If you do right, I bless you. If you do wrong, I punish you. I will bless you in accordance with how well you're doing, and I will punish you in accordance with how bad you're doing. And once you get to, in this case, DEFCON 5, which is opposite of what we do nukes, I know. You get to this level, God says, that's it, you're done. And because of the rejection of Israel, of Messiah by Israel in the story here that we see today, Israel has been, their temple has been destroyed, never rebuilt. Israel has been scattered, not rejoined, and that won't happen until the end times. Now, at some point, usually a hand pops up, but what about Israel, the state of Israel today? I don't mean to offend anyone in here, but I will tell you my position about the state of Israel today. One, Israel, the nation, is not biblical Israel. Okay, it is political Israel. It is a step down the path to the reuniting of Israel that we'll see at the end times. We should support the nation of Israel, both as Christians, because we understand the importance of Israel and God's plan, and we understand that they are allies of the United States against the ridiculous terrorism that just seems to pop out of everywhere. But Israel, this is my opinion, Israel today, the political nation, is not biblical Israel that we see, because the Jews are still scattered everywhere. There is not a temple at this point. We know a temple has to be rebuilt so it can be destroyed again. It can be defamed by the Antichrist. And I know a lot, this is controversial because a lot of people today do believe that the nation of Israel is equal to the biblical Israel, but I can't find that in my study. To me, it's a step on the way, but it's still a political nation. That's like saying, I don't know, the state of Finland is a biblical nation. We just can't, even though Israel is called Israel and it's there in the Middle East and everything, we just can't label something biblical unless God labels it that way. And God's punishment here has dispersed the Jews not to be gathered together again until the end times. And at the end times, the Jews do get the fulfillment of that promise that God gave to Abraham, where they get the lands. Right now, Israel has this little tiny little joint that they're living in. if you really want to upset a Muslim brother, just show him what a map looks like of what Israel gets when God gives them the land. It's everything. It is everything. It is huge if you look at the biblical lands that God's going to give Israel. And right now they don't have that. They got this little tiny place where they hang out. It's a wonderful place, cradle of Christianity, cradle of Judaism, but they're still under this punishment, in my opinion, that God has given. Okay, so now Jesus condemns them, and we go over to 41. Okay, where Matthew 12, they asked for a sign. Okay, this is interesting. They're asking for a sign. Verse 38. Then some experts in the law, along with some Pharisees, answered him, "Teacher, we want to see a sign from you." Okay, now think about this. What has Jesus done so far? Okay, he cured a Jewish leper, right? He went ahead and raised a guy from the dead. He cured a man born blind. Okay, he cured a person with a birth defect, right? We talked about that. And now he's just driven a demon out in a way that the Pharisees can't even do. And the Pharisees go, we'd love to believe you. Could you just give us a sign? It is amazing. We need a sign. Well, then Jesus says, well, I'll give you a sign. It's a sign of Jonah. Now, I know everybody at this point says, oh, yeah, this is about Jesus' resurrection. I have a slightly different spin on this. If you study the book of Jonah, a couple of years back, we had a brilliant guest preacher. The guy was amazing, and he did a 5-week series on Jonah. Oh, he was amazing. That guy was probably one of the finest guest preachers. It was me. Okay, in case you don't remember. And not only was he a brilliant preacher, handsome man too. Yeah, and he's humble. He was just great. I wish we could bring him back. Anyway, when you study Jonah, what you find interesting about Jonah is the bad guy in the story. And my whole sermon series on Jonah was the takeaway I wanted everybody to say, don't be Jonah. That was my very first sermon, 5th sermon in the series. I said, don't be Jonah. That's what we need to learn from this. Because Jonah did everything he could to run away from God and to not do what God wanted him to do. And every time that Jonah got shown to be the knucklehead he was, it was by non-God-fearing people. See, the pagans, the non-God-fearing people, were the ones who were held up as a mirror in the book of Jonah to show Jonah what an idiot he was. Well, that's where I think Jesus is going here. He's saying, look, you'll get a sign. You'll get the sign that Jonah got. The non-God-fearing people are going to stand up and mock you for rejecting the Messiah. The non-God-fearing people are going to punish you for rejecting him. See, that's where I think, now I understand, and I'm not discounting the link to Jonah and the resurrection, but I'm saying that I think there was a bigger picture here, that the sign of Jonah was a believer rejecting God and then being proven wrong by those who were not followers of God. And if you think about in Jonah, on the boat, when they finally chucked Jonah over the side and the seas calm, what did those sailors do? They worshiped Jonah's God because they got it, right? Is Chuck here? No, Chuck's not here today. Navy guys are tough guys, okay? And they figured out who God was. And Jonah, who was on a personal mission from God, completely was running away and had to be punished. I think that's where Jesus is going here with this. But then if we go up here, Jesus then in verse 41, Matthew 12, he says, the people of Nineveh will stand up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it because they repented when Jonah preached to them. And now something even greater than Jonah is here. The queen of the south will rise up at the judgment in this generation and condemn it because she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon. And now something even greater than Solomon is here. So here Jesus is explaining this sign of Jonah thing. He's saying, you Pharisees are rejecting Messiah, claiming he's doing the work of Satan, and you will be condemned by your own words and actions by those who are outside of Israel. That you have something even greater than the miracles. You have Messiah standing in front of you, working the messianic miracles, yet you reject it. So Jesus condemns them in the harshest terms. And again, notice the language, it's that generation. They will be punished. They were punished in 70 AD. It's interesting in the history of Israel and Rome, we sort of end, most of us, at 70 AD, but in reality, the Jews kept fighting back against Rome, and probably kept fighting back for the next 100 years or so after that. And this ties in to something here. Around 130, 140, there was a guy called Barkukba, and he came along claiming to be Messiah. And he got a lot of the Jews who were scattered, because remember, no temple, no Jerusalem, but he was able to rally the Jews in that area at the time and got a pretty good-sized army of Jews. And he decided, because I'm Messiah, I'm going to conquer Rome. I am going to break Israel's bonds to Rome. And several of the rabbis got behind him and said, oh, this man is terrific. He is wonderful. Well, yeah, Barkukba fought Rome and got destroyed. Okay, I mean, thousands and thousands of Jews were slaughtered by Rome, and they put Barkukba down flat. It's called the Barkukba Uprising. After the fact, one of the interesting things that a historian at the time said was, well, in retrospect, Barkukba couldn't have been the Messiah because he couldn't work the miracles. So here is a historian in around 130, 140 AD explaining why the final Jewish revolt against Rome failed, because the guy claiming to be Messiah couldn't work the miracles. So this idea was there about Messiah and these miracles, but the Jews failed. The Pharisees, the scribes, experts in the law, I always love that term, are the ones that failed. Okay, in the very last set of notes here I've given you, this is a chart. This is not my chart, by the way. I borrowed this from someone. You know, when you do academic study, if you copy something that someone else has done, that's called plagiarism. But if you copy something that 3 or 4 people have done, that's research. So most of the stuff that I do in here is research, okay? So in this case, this is plagiarism, because this is one person did this chart. But I love this chart because we see a change now in Jesus's messianic ministry. Up to this point, he has been presenting the kingdom. He's been doing the messianic miracles. He's been presenting himself to Israel as the Messiah. And when we read the Gospels, we find that this is a pivotal point in how Jesus does his ministry. Okay? Now you can see on this chart, we have the public ministry across the top. We have his birth. We covered that. Public ministry. And then next week, we're going to talk about the triumphant entry. Triumphal entry, triumphant entry. I'm sure scholars write books about which is the correct term. Because scholars like to argue anything. And in the middle, between preparation and sacrifice, you have Jesus. Right down the center, middle Galilean ministry is the pivotal day when Israel rejects Messiah, claiming that it's the work of Satan. You see the very second column. Jesus now changes how he ministers. And there's 3 key points that he does. Number 1, he starts to hide the fact that he's Messiah. He says, don't tell anybody. He does something amazing, and he says, don't tell them I'm Messiah. Don't tell them what you saw, right? We'll see when we do the transfiguration. Jesus says, next week's transfiguration, the following week's triumphal entry. When they do that, he says, don't tell anybody what you saw. Don't tell them that Moses and Elijah appeared with me, right? We have what scholars call the Messianic secret, The second thing is he changes from miracles to show Israel he was Messiah to very personal miracles. Miracles to promote faith amongst his disciples. Miracles of a personal nature to help someone out by grace and mercy. And the third thing he does, he changes from teaching fairly clear propositional truth, like we see in the Sermon on the Mount. You've heard it said, but it is written, right? That kind of teaching, very straightforward. Now he starts relying heavily on parables. And he tells the disciples that's intentional because it's to obscure the truth. Now, if we go to Isaiah, and I put the reference there, we'll see that this is sort of a prophetic fulfillment, that those who don't believe, those who are against Israel and against God, will be blinded. They'll be deaf to the truth. And so Jesus starts telling parables. Now, I know there's been a couple little parable kind of things before this, but it becomes heavy. He starts teaching multiple parables. We get the parables where he says, okay, there was a guy going down the road, blah, blah, blah. And then all the disciples go, okay, we had no clue what you just said, Lord. What does that mean, right? We start to get parables now to teach these truths of the kingdom, truths of God's work, but in a manner that's going to be hidden from those experts in the law that are trying to condemn Jesus. So this miracle of the driving out of the demon, the attributing of God's work to Satan, is the pivotal point in Jesus' ministry from Messiah presenting the kingdom to now a sacrificial Messiah who is going to hide the truth from the leaders of Israel to promote the faith amongst his the faithful remnant that we find, the disciples. And we find that faithful remnant will carry that truth now as we get over into Acts 2 with the beginning of the church. So this is a pivotal day, this rejection of the Messiah. There will be one more time when Messiah is officially presented to Israel. That's on what we call Palm Sunday. And that is tying to the prophecy in Daniel, and we'll see that in 2 weeks, the triumphal entry, which is then immediately followed by the persecution and death of Christ, the physical death, which fulfills Daniel's cutting off of the Messiah. And so next week, we're going to look at what I think is a huge example of just how Israel, the work of Messiah, the feasts and worship of Israel, and sort of the overall view of God's work gets tied together in one single event, the Transfiguration. But realize that comes after this pivotal center of the ministry, rejection. Questions? You've been so quiet. Is everybody still awake? Hello? Oh, you. I know, that was so good. Would you like, no, I'll tell it again later if you want me to. Yeah, Bill.
Okay, so on to the national Israel versus biblical Israel. The first, after original exile and then coming back, was Zerubbabel with Ezra
Right.
and Nehemiah. So officially there was a time where it really came back to be at that point where they've returned. How do you look at now, kind of that transition, I'd say, of national Israel, which is political and everything, but when do you think it becomes biblical, the temple and stuff, when would you describe it and how you kind of explain it? When would you say it becomes biblical Israel?
Okay, the question, for those of you playing along in the home game, that was asked by Bill was, how do I describe when Israel returns this time if current national Israel is not the final version of Israel? And Bill brought out that we see clearly in Scripture after the Babylonian captivity, Israel was returned, and we have the reading of the law and the rebuilding of the temple and all that. So what do we expect that to happen? What do I expect to happen for Israel this time beyond just what we have as national Israel now? Okay, again, this is my opinion. A lot of people agree with me on this. A lot of people disagree. But this is my opinion. I'm a good staunch dispensationalist. I'm a premillennial dispensationalist, and I'm a pre-trib premillennial dispensationalist. So those of you who like big theological words, that explains what I believe. Now let me tell you what it means in real words. I believe that at some point the church will be removed from the earth. That's called the rapture. And the church is all of those living believers, and all of those believers who have gone to the grave will be gathered together in heaven, physically together. The church will be removed from the earth. At that point, that's the rapture. At that point, there's going to be a 7-year period where God will enact punishment on the earth, non-believers, and he will restore Israel through punishment and teaching and just working with Israel during that 7 years. That's the tribulation. It's going to be ugly, but we know that Israel will be regathered during that period of time, be restored during that period of time. At the end of that 7-year period, Christ and his church will return to earth to set up the Messianic kingdom, which will go for 1,000 years. That's the millennium. During that time, Israel will have been restored. Israel will come back to the Lord and be regathered. The fulfillment of the promises of land, political power, and spiritual blessings will be fully given to Israel, and that will last for 1,000 years. At the end of that, there will be one final battle where Satan and all those who follow him will be judged and thrown into the abyss for eternity. God will then recreate the heavens and the earth to create a new heavens and earth where God will reign forever along with the church and restored Israel. So that's kind of the timeline. Now, biblically, I can walk you through from the rapture to after 1,007 years to when the end of the world is. Problem is, I don't know when the rapture is going to occur. You can't figure that out biblically. So in my scenario, at some point it's going to happen. I don't know when it will, but that starts the clock ticking again for the restoration of Israel. And again, anybody that'll tell you, yeah, Dan, I'll get you in a second. Anybody that'll tell you they know when the rapture is going to occur, I would turn around and run, because that's knowledge God has not given us. God has told us what happens right after the rapture. He says, look, I got a 1,007-year period here. But coming up to that point, we don't know. But that is when the beginning of the restoration of Israel will take place. I believe it will include national Israel. I mean, there's a group of faithful remnant that exists, but I think there's a faithful remnant that exists other places as well. Dan.
Yeah, and perhaps never to miss an opportunity for dispensational indoctrination.
That's right.
But there is perhaps a better and more simple way to answer, which is that how did the exile know that they were authentic Israel? Okay, and that's because Jeremiah said 70 years, this is what's going to happen, laid out very specifically, mapped out for what that was, so they knew they were authentic Israel. They will know they're authentic Israel exactly the same way, which is that Scripture lays out the signs and things that happen when that occurs. And what John is trying to say is that those things haven't happened yet, and so how can we call it authentic Israel until the things that say this is when authentic Israel occurs? That's the point of it, right?
Yeah, and Dan's right. Dan has always had the uncanny ability to actually translate for me. Dan has been, no, I have to tell you, Dan has been in my Sunday school classes since he and I were both in short pants. And and Dan, I'll ramble on in some ridiculous, answer to a question. Dan will go, okay, so what John really meant to say, and Dan can do it in like a sentence. So Dan is completely right. What Dan said was, if we skip the dispensational indoctrination, which I want everybody to be dispensational, and I'm trying to mold your minds in that way. But yeah, the Bible told Israel in captivity, this is when you will be Israel restored. And the Bible tells Israel today, this is what restored Israel will look like the second time. It's right there in the text. I just like to put in all the pre-trib, all that stuff, because it's fun. You could write a whole book series on, somebody. Oh my goodness, they have. And I missed it. Oh my goodness.
And movies. And infomercials.
And infomercials, yeah.
One thing that I guess as believers we should be looking at is Israel is planning on rebuilding the temple. They've already made plans for it. They're waiting for the red heifer, which is the pure red heifer. Jerusalem is now the capital of Israel. It was recognized by former President Trump. They've already made, so it's already going that direction.
Yeah, I think, and that's a very good point that you bring up. The point is brought up that Israel is preparing for that time to be regathered, and I think they always have been, to tell you the truth. But I think nowadays but again, this is personal. This is my view, and you guys know how much you paid for a ticket to be here today, and that's about what my personal view is worth. Nothing. But my personal view is that I am uncomfortable 100% being one of these guys on TV with a Bible on one knee and the newspaper on the other. But I think you can see, God is moving on God's timetable. And we see little glimpses of that. And as believers who study his word, we go, I bet we're moving on God's timetable. And the key thing is that we're open to see that, and people who aren't open to God and the word, they won't see it. But Israel is going to be restored in exactly the way God has prophesied for them to be restored. And no differently, just like God prophesied Messiah, and Jesus fulfilled that exactly. So it's God's plan. And I trust in him. Oh, they barely put me in charge of this class. God wouldn't dare put me in charge of something bigger. So, all right, I will see everybody next week. Same bat time, same bat channel. Thank you. No applause, no applesauce.